Before the rise of Rome, before the golden age of Greece, there was another time of giants, the late Bronze Age. It was a thriving, interconnected world, a world of great, glittering empires. The powerful Hittites in their mountain fortresses, the seafaring Mycenaeans in their golden palaces, and the eternal kingdom of Egypt on the Nile. For centuries, they were rivals and partners, their kings exchanging letters written on clay, their ships carrying copper, tin, and treasures across the sea. It was a world that felt ancient, powerful, and permanent. And then, in the space of a single generation, it all burned. A storm of fire and steel swept across the civilized world. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were turned to ash. Great empires vanished from memory. And at the heart of this mystery was a new kind of enemy, a ghost that came from the sea. This is the story of that mysterious apocalypse. It is the story of two worlds colliding. A desperate, migrating horde with nothing to lose, and the last great empire of the ancient world, fighting for its very survival. Chapter 1. The Last Beacon. The Empire of Egypt. To understand the stakes of this great war, we must first understand the world that was fighting to survive. We must turn to the land of Egypt, in the early 12th century BC, during the reign of the Pharaoh Ramesses III. This was the New Kingdom, a civilization that had already existed for nearly 2,000 years. To the Egyptians, their world was eternal, a perfect reflection of the divine order, or Ma'at, that governed the cosmos. Theirs was Kemet, the Black Land, a ribbon of impossibly fertile soil, nourished by the predictable, life-giving flood of the Nile. It was a land of stability and immense wealth, a beacon of order in a world that was beginning to descend into chaos. The man on the throne, Ramesses III, was the founder of a new dynasty, the 20th. He had inherited a kingdom that had recently endured civil strife, and he was deeply conscious of the legacy he had to uphold. He named himself after the greatest of all pharaohs, Ramesses the Great, and he sought to emulate his predecessor's power and glory in every way. He was a great builder, commissioning vast extensions to the temples at Karnak and erecting his own magnificent mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, where the story of his great war would one day be carved in stone for all eternity. He was a capable, determined, and intelligent ruler, a pharaoh worthy of the Golden Age. But he was a man destined to rule not in an age of glory, but in an age of endings. The Egypt he commanded was still a formidable power. Its society was a complex and ancient pyramid. At its peak was the pharaoh, a living god, the incarnation of Horus on earth. Below him were the powerful priests, especially the priesthood of the state god Amun-Ra at Thebes, whose wealth and influence from their vast temple estates sometimes rivaled that of the throne itself. Below them were the scribes, the artisans, and the great mass of farmers, whose labor was the engine of the entire economy, their lives tied to the timeless rhythm of the river's flood and retreat. And when called upon, This ancient kingdom could assemble a truly fearsome military machine. The pride of the Egyptian army was its chariot corps. These were the elite, the fast-moving tanks of the ancient world. A chariot was a light, two-wheeled vehicle, crewed by a driver and an archer, both clad in bronze-scale armor. Firing their powerful composite bows from this moving platform, a division of Egyptian chariots could unleash a devastating storm of arrows upon an enemy infantry line, breaking its formation before the real fighting had even begun. The backbone of the army was the infantry, organized into large divisions named after the great gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. These were the Naktu-A, the strong arm boys, professional soldiers armed with the curved bronze sickle sword known as the Khopesh, as well as spears, axes, and daggers. They fought behind large, brightly painted shields, moving as a disciplined unit that had dominated the battlefields of the Near East for centuries. But the army of Ramesses III was not composed solely of Egyptians. The empire had a long tradition of incorporating foreign warriors into its ranks, mercenaries who were paid in land and rations for their loyalty and skill. Among the most prized of these were the Sherdan, a group of seafaring warriors, possibly from Sardinia, who had once fought against Egypt, but were now among the pharaoh's most elite bodyguards. They were instantly recognizable on the battlefield, with their distinctive horned helmets and their long, straight swords, a fighting style different from the native Egyptians. This cosmopolitan army was experienced, well-equipped, and deeply loyal to the pharaoh. This was the empire that the storm was approaching, a kingdom of immense wealth, ancient tradition, and formidable military power. It was the last great light of the Bronze Age, a civilization that believed itself to be eternal, protected by the gods, and governed by a living god on the throne. But it was also an empire in its twilight. The days of its greatest expansion were over, and its connections to the wider world made it vulnerable. It was a beacon of order, yes, but it stood alone in a world that was rapidly being consumed by a new and mysterious darkness. Chapter 2: The Storm from the Sea. The mystery of the sea. Peoples? Who were they? This is the great unanswered question at the heart of the Bronze Age collapse. Who were these people who rose from the sea, seemingly from nowhere, and brought an entire world to its knees? They left no writings of their own, no cities to mark their origins. They are a ghost in the pages of history, a people known to us only through the terrified eyes of their victims, and primarily through the grand stone-carved testimony of the one kingdom that survived them. To understand this mysterious enemy, we must travel to the great mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. Here, covering the vast temple walls, the pharaoh carved his monument to the Great War. In these detailed reliefs, the sea peoples are brought to life, and we can see them as the Egyptians saw them. They are depicted as a diverse and formidable coalition, a confederation of different tribes united in a single destructive purpose. The Egyptian scribes gave them names. There were the Peleset and the Chiker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, names that historians have tried to link to the Philistines, to Sicily, to Greece, or to the coast of Anatolia. Their appearance was unlike that of the familiar armies of the ancient world. The most iconic among them wore tall, elaborate feathered headdresses, giving them a fierce and imposing look. They carried round shields and long, straight swords, a style different from the Egyptians. They were a new kind of warrior. But the most chilling detail carved into the temple walls has nothing to do with their weapons. It is the depiction of their families. Behind the warriors, the reliefs show a second wave of people: women, children, and the elderly, riding slowly in heavy, solid-wheeled ox carts, their faces etched with the hardship of a long journey. This was the key to their terrifying nature. They were not a simple raiding army. They were a nation on the move, a people uprooted, a migrating horde. They had brought their entire world with them, because their old world was gone. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for a new home. Among this confederation, one group had a long and complicated history with Egypt: the Sherdon, instantly recognizable by their distinctive horned helmets, large round shields. The Sherdon were elite and ferocious warriors. They first appeared in Egyptian records decades earlier, not as allies, but as dangerous sea pirates who were raiding the rich coastline of the Nile Delta during the reign of Ramesses the Great. The young pharaoh met them in a great sea battle, and according to his inscriptions, decisively defeated them, capturing many of their warriors. But Ramesses the Great, recognizing their incredible fighting skill, did something remarkable. He did not simply enslave or execute the captured Sherdon. He incorporated them into his own army. These former pirates became an elite division in the Egyptian military, and some were even chosen to serve as the personal bodyguards of the pharaoh himself. Reliefs from the Battle of Kadesh famously show these horned, helmeted warriors fighting bravely for Egypt. This is the great irony. The same people who would later form a core part of the Sea People's invasion were, for a time, the trusted protectors of the Egyptian throne. This strange relationship highlights the chaotic and shifting nature of the era, where an enemy one day could be an ally the next. But where did the Sherdon and the rest of these tribes come from? The question has haunted historians for centuries. Some believe they were refugees from the collapsing Mycenaean world of ancient Greece. Others believe they came from the coast of Anatolia, pushed out by the famine and chaos that destroyed the Hittite Empire. Still other theories link them to the islands of the Mediterranean, like Sicily or Sardinia. The most likely truth is that they were not one people, but a mix of many. A perfect storm, a great domino effect of collapse, where the fall of one kingdom would send a wave of refugees crashing into the next, with the survivors of that collapse joining the growing horde. They were a symptom of a dying world, a collection of desperate peoples from all over the Mediterranean whose old homes had been destroyed. They were the homeless, the desperate, and the hungry. And that is what made them so dangerous. They had absolutely nothing to lose. And so, this great, mysterious, and unstoppable storm, this coalition of desperate warriors and their families, having already laid waste to every other great power in their path, was now sailing with a singular, final purpose. They were headed for the last great prize. The one kingdom that was still rich, still fertile, and still standing. They were headed for Egypt. Chapter 3. The World Burns. The Fall of the Hittite Empire. Before the final invasion of Egypt, the Sea Peoples carved a path of destruction across the entire eastern Mediterranean. To understand the terror that gripped the court of Ramesses III, we must first witness the fate of his greatest rival, the other superpower of the Bronze Age. We must travel to the rugged highlands of Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, to the mountain kingdom of the Hittites. For 500 years, the Hittite Empire had been a force of nature. They were a hardy, militaristic people, masters of the iron chariot, who had built an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of Mesopotamia. They were the only power on earth that had fought the armies of the great Ramesses II to a standstill at the legendary Battle of Kadesh. Their capital city, Hattusa, was a wonder of the ancient world, a fortress city built amidst rocky crags, protected by miles of massive stone walls and gates guarded by immense carved lions and sphinxes. The Hittite Empire was a symbol of strength and permanence, and it was about to be utterly erased from existence. Even before the invaders arrived, the Hittite kingdom was in crisis. A series of devastating droughts had triggered a widespread and catastrophic famine. We know this from the Hittites' own records. In the last surviving clay tablets from their archives, we can hear the desperate voice of the final Hittite kings and queens. They sent urgent letters to their allies and vassals, including the Pharaoh of Egypt, pleading for help. One letter from the Hittite queen to Ramesses II reads simply, "I have no grain in my lands." Another letter, found in the port city of Ugarit, is a desperate demand for a ship to be sent with 2,000 measures of grain, a final, futile attempt to save a starving population. The great empire was already being weakened from within by hunger and the political unrest that came with it. It was into this fragile, starving empire that the storm finally broke. The historical record is silent on the exact details of the final battles, but the archaeological evidence is brutally clear. Sometime around the year 1200 BC, a wave of violent destruction swept through the Hittite heartland. Great cities that had been centers of power and culture for centuries were put to the torch. And finally, the invaders reached the great capital of Hattusa itself. Imagine the final, desperate battle. The last Hittite warriors, weakened by famine, standing on their great stone walls, watching a horde of strange feathered warriors swarming up the rocky slopes. The great gates of the city were smashed and burned. The vast temples of the storm god were looted and desecrated. The royal palace, where generations of great kings had ruled, was consumed by a fire so intense that it turned the mud brick walls back into vitrified glass-like stone. The city was not just conquered, it was annihilated. It was abandoned, and its location was so completely forgotten that for 3,000 years, the entire Hittite civilization was known only as a mysterious, half-forgotten name in the Old Testament. The silence was absolute. Their complex society, their unique languages, their powerful gods, all vanished into the ashes. It was as if a great mountain had simply crumbled into dust. The news of this collapse, the impossible fall of their greatest rival, must have reached Egypt like a terrifying shockwave. The Pharaoh Ramesses III now knew the truth. The enemy approaching his borders was not a simple army of raiders. They were a force capable of destroying the very foundations of the world. The Hittites were gone, and the Egyptians knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were next. Chapter 4. A Civilization Lost. The End of the Mycenaeans. While the Hittites were the masters of the highlands, the Aegean Sea belonged to another power entirely. They were the Mycenaeans, the first Greeks, the historical civilization that lived behind the great myths of Homer. This was the age of heroes, the world of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus. They were a loose confederation of warrior kingdoms, each ruled by a powerful king, or wanax, from within a mighty fortified citadel. Their centers of power were legendary. Mycenae, rich in gold, with its massive Lion Gate, the mighty fortress of Tiryns, and the beautiful palace of Nestor at Pylos. They were a sophisticated and wealthy people. Their tombs have yielded treasures of breathtaking beauty, like the golden funeral mask that its discoverer famously declared to be the face of Agamemnon. They were master sailors and traders, their ships dominating the sea lanes from the shores of Greece to the coast of Egypt. And they had a complex bureaucracy, keeping meticulous records of their goods and soldiers on clay tablets, written in a script we call Linear B. For centuries, the Mycenaeans were the lords of the Aegean, but they knew, with a certainty that we can still read today, that a terrible danger was approaching from the sea. In the final years of their civilization, a frantic wave of construction took place. They massively expanded and strengthened the fortifications of their palaces, building walls so enormous, with stones so large that later, Greeks believed they must have been built by the mythical Cyclopes. They also undertook ingenious engineering projects, constructing secret, hidden passages that led from inside the citadels to underground springs, ensuring they would have a protected water supply in the event of a long and terrible siege. They were a people preparing for a fight for their lives. The most chilling evidence of their fear comes from the last clay tablets they ever wrote. In the burnt ruins of the Palace of Pylos, archaeologists found the final records of the Mycenaean kingdom. These were not poems or legends. They were the frantic, administrative last gasps of a society on the brink of collapse. The tablets list the deployment of troops and ships along the coastline. They speak of watchers of the coast, soldiers sent to scan the horizon for the arrival of an enemy fleet. They record the desperate collection of bronze from every source to be melted down and forged into spears and arrows. And they detail last-minute religious offerings, frantic pleas to the gods to save them from the coming doom. Then, the records go silent. The fire that consumed the palace of Pylos was so intense that it accidentally baked these soft clay tablets into hard ceramic, preserving them for us to read. They are the final, panicked heartbeats of a dying civilization. The end came swiftly and violently. Around the year 1200 BC, a wave of destruction swept through Greece. Every single major Mycenaean palace center was destroyed, and most were never resettled. The great citadels that were once the centers of wealth and power were left as blackened, smoking ruins. With the collapse of the palaces, the entire complex society they supported simply disintegrated. The sophisticated bureaucracy, the international trade, the luxury goods, the master craftsmen, it all vanished. And most tragically, the art of writing itself was lost. The linear B script, which had been used for 500 years, disappeared completely. For the next 4 centuries, Greece was plunged into a dark age, a period of poverty, depopulation, and illiteracy. The memory of the great Mycenaean kings survived only in the distorted form of myth and epic poetry. The destruction of the Mycenaeans was a catastrophe for the people of Greece, but it had a wider consequence for the entire Mediterranean. With the great naval power of the Aegean now shattered, the sea lanes were left completely undefended. The pirates, raiders, and migrants who had brought down the palaces were now free to roam. Many of these displaced and now battle-hardened warriors likely joined the growing confederation of the Sea Peoples, swelling their numbers and adding to their naval strength. The storm, having now consumed the highlands of Anatolia and the islands of the Aegean, was gathering its full and terrible strength upon the sea. And there was now only one great, wealthy, and stable target left on the horizon. The last beacon of the Old World, Egypt. Chapter 5. The Pharaoh's Gambit. The news of the fall of the Hittites and the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces would have arrived in Egypt like a series of terrifying aftershocks. The world that Egypt had known for centuries, a world of powerful rivals, allies, and trading partners, was simply gone. The Pharaoh, Ramesses III, was now the ruler of a lonely kingdom, the last great beacon of civilization in a sea of darkness and chaos. He was no longer just the king of Egypt. He was the last guardian of the Bronze Age. From his capital at Ramesses, he would have listened to the chilling reports from refugees and spies. They spoke of a new kind of warfare, of a migratory horde that fought with a desperate ferocity, and of a confederation so vast it had swallowed entire empires. He knew this enemy was now gathering its full strength, and he knew that their final destination was his own fertile and wealthy land. In this desperate hour, the Pharaoh did not despair. He began to prepare for the greatest war in his country's long history. His strategy was methodical and brilliant, a grand gambit upon which the fate of his civilization would rest. He understood that the Sea Peoples presented a dual threat, a coordinated invasion by both land and sea, and he prepared for both. To counter the land invasion, he massively reinforced Egypt's eastern frontier, the great network of fortresses and watchtowers that guarded the approaches from the Sinai Desert, known as the Ways of Horus, was fully manned. He positioned his finest infantry divisions and his elite chariot corps to create an impenetrable wall of bronze, ready to halt the slow-moving horde of warriors and their ox carts. But it was the naval attack that presented the greatest and most terrifying challenge. The Egyptians were traditionally a land power. Their army was legendary, but their navy was designed for the predictable, calm waters of the Nile, not for the open chaos of the Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples, by their very name, were masters of the sea. Their ships were likely heavier and built for ocean warfare. To meet them in a conventional battle on the open water would be to play their game, a risk Ramesses was not willing to take. So, the pharaoh devised a brilliant and daring trap. He would not fight them on the open sea. He would lure them into his world, into a battlefield of his own choosing, where all of their advantages would be neutralized and all of his would be magnified. The kill zone was to be the intricate, winding mouths of the Nile Delta. Imagine this unique landscape. It is not an open coastline, but a confusing, waterlogged labyrinth of branching river channels, shallow sandbanks, dense papyrus swamps, and small, marshy islands. It was a place that the Egyptian navy, with their lighter, more maneuverable ships, knew intimately. But for a foreign fleet of heavy, deep-hulled vessels, it would be a confusing and claustrophobic death trap, with no room to maneuver and no clear path forward. The pharaoh's plan was to turn the entire delta into a giant, three-sided ambush. First, he lined the banks of the narrow river channels with his most elite forces. Hidden from view in the tall, dense papyrus reeds, thousands of Egypt's finest archers lay in wait, their arrows ready. Behind them stood ranks of infantry, ready to pick off any who managed to swim to shore. Next, he took his main fleet, the Egyptian navy, and hid it in the side channels and concealed inlets of the delta. Their job was not to meet the enemy head-on, but to wait. They were the blocking force. Once the Sea People's armada had sailed deep into the main channel of the river, the Egyptian fleet would surge out from their hiding places and seal the entrance back to the open sea, cutting off any chance of retreat. The entire strategy was conceived as a great net. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe it with this powerful metaphor. The enemy would be lured into the trap, the mouth of the net would be pulled shut behind them, and then, from all sides at once, the hunters would close in. It was a daring and ingenious gambit, a plan that relied on perfect timing, disciplined concealment, and an intimate knowledge of the land. The preparations were complete. The armies were mustered on the frontiers. The archers lay silent in the marshes. The fleet was hidden, waiting for the signal. The full might of the ancient Egyptian empire was coiled like a great serpent, ready to strike. All of Egypt held its breath, its gaze fixed on the northern horizon, waiting for the first sight of the sails that had brought fire and ruin to the rest of the world. Chapter 6. The Land Invasion. A Wall of Bronze. The first blow of the Great Invasion did not fall upon the shores of the Nile Delta, but upon the fortified land borders of the eastern Sinai. This was the overland route, the path taken by the great migrating horde of the Sea Peoples, their warriors marching alongside the heavy, slow-moving ox carts that carried their families and all their worldly possessions. This was not a scouting party or a simple raiding force. This was an entire nation on the march, a relentless tide of humanity seeking to overwhelm Egypt's defenses through sheer numbers and desperation. From the battlements of the Egyptian border fortresses, the soldiers of the Pharaoh would have watched their approach with a mixture of awe and terror. They would have seen a sight unlike any they had ever encountered. A great mass of warriors, a sea of the now infamous feathered headdresses of the Peliset, mixed with the horned helmets of the Shurden and the strange crests of other allied tribes. They carried their distinctive round shields and long, straight swords, and they advanced with the grim determination of a people who had already burned a dozen other kingdoms. Behind them, stretching back for miles, was the endless train of their families, a stark and constant reminder that for these invaders there was no possibility of retreat. But Ramesses III was prepared for them. He had not neglected his land defenses. Here, on the flat, open plains of the desert frontier, the traditional might of the Egyptian army was at its strongest. The pharaoh had deployed his finest infantry divisions, the battle-hardened veterans of his campaigns, drawn up in disciplined ranks. A veritable wall of bronze shields and spear points. From the walls of the forts, thousands of archers stood ready, their bowstrings drawn tight, and held in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, was the pride of the Egyptian military, the elite chariot corps. As the Sea People's infantry advanced, they were met with a storm of Egyptian arrows. The sky would have darkened with the sheer volume of projectiles, each one designed to disrupt their charge and sow chaos in their ranks. But the invaders were a battle-hardened force, and they pressed on, crashing against the disciplined Egyptian shield wall. The brutal, hand-to-hand fighting began. A chaotic melee of stabbing spears and clanging swords. It was at this moment that the pharaoh unleashed his decisive weapon. The ground would have begun to tremble, a low rumble that grew into a thunderous roar as hundreds of Egyptian war chariots surged onto the battlefield. This was the classic Egyptian strategy, perfected over centuries of warfare. The chariots were not heavy, armored behemoths, but light, fast-moving platforms of destruction. They did not charge directly into the enemy lines, but instead swept across their flanks at incredible speed. Imagine the terrifying sight. A wave of chariots, each kicking up a great plume of dust, appearing as if from nowhere on the enemy's side. The archers standing beside the drivers would fire volley after volley of arrows into the unprotected sides and backs of the Sea People's warriors. These were mobile missile platforms, a whirlwind of death that could strike and disappear before the enemy even had time to turn and face them. They would charge, fire, wheel away, and charge again, relentlessly harassing and breaking apart the enemy's formation. The Sea Peoples, who were primarily infantry, and whose tactics were suited for naval landings and chaotic raids, had no effective counter for this kind of organized, high-speed warfare. Their ranks were broken, their leaders targeted, and their charge faltered. Once the chariot corps had done its devastating work, the Egyptian infantry advanced, pushing back the disorganized and demoralized invaders. The victory on land was absolute and brutal. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe it with the stark language of a conqueror. "I have overthrown the invaders, slain their warriors, and what my arm has captured, I have taken away. I have laid their land low, and it is made non-existent for ever and ever." The great land invasion, which had been the doom of so many other kingdoms, was shattered against the disciplined might of the Egyptian army. The surviving warriors were slain or captured, and their families and possessions were taken as the spoils of war. The pharaoh had secured his eastern border. The first wave of the storm had been broken, but this, Ramesses knew, was only the beginning. The battle on land, as decisive as it was, had only defeated one arm of the great invasion. The true heart of the enemy's power, their great and undefeated naval fleet, was still out there, sailing inexorably towards the fertile heart of his kingdom, the Nile Delta. The fate of Egypt would not be decided on the hot sands of the desert, but in the cool, dark waters of the river. The great battle was over. The waters of the Nile ran clear again. The existential threat of the Sea Peoples had been broken upon the rock of the Egyptian war machine. The victory was absolute, a triumph of strategy and will against overwhelming odds. Ramesses III had done what no other king of his age could do. He had faced the storm that ended the world, and he had survived. In the immediate aftermath, the spoils of war were collected. The captured Sea People's warriors and their families were paraded through the streets of Thebes in a great victory procession. Many of the warriors, their strength and ferocity respected even in defeat, were branded and incorporated into the Egyptian army as mercenaries. Their fighting skill would now be used to defend the very borders they had tried to conquer. Others, most notably the powerful Peliset tribe, were settled as vassals in fortified garrison towns along Egypt's territories in southern Canaan. Here, they would put down new roots. Their culture would slowly transform, and they would become known to history by a different name: the Philistines. In a stroke of historical irony, the great enemy of Egypt would become its new neighbor, a permanent and often troublesome reminder of the great invasion. With the threat neutralized, it would seem that Egypt had earned a new golden age. But the victory was a hollow one. The war had been won, but the world that Egypt had known was gone forever. The intricate web of trade that had been the lifeblood of the Bronze Age had been irrevocably severed. The great empires that had been Egypt's trading partners were now smoking ruins. The immense cost of the war, combined with this economic collapse, had completely bankrupted the Egyptian treasury. The signs of this internal rot began to appear late in Ramesses's long reign. In the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the elite and previously well-paid artisans who carved the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, we find a remarkable record. A papyrus from the 29th year of the pharaoh's rule details the world's first recorded labor strike. The state, for the first time in memory, had failed to deliver the monthly rations of grain and beer that served as the workers' wages. The men who carved the eternal homes for the gods and kings laid down their chisels and their brushes. They marched out of their village and towards the great temples, chanting a simple, desperate phrase: "We are hungry." The divine order, the principle of Ma'at, was breaking down. The state that had defeated the sea peoples could no longer afford to feed its most valued workers. But the greatest danger to the pharaoh was not in the streets. It was in his own home. As Ramesses grew older, the question of his succession became a source of intense intrigue within the royal palace. And from this intrigue, a dark and terrible plot was born. A story we know in detail from a surviving court document, the Judicial Papyrus of Turin. It was a plot to murder the living God himself. The conspiracy was led by one of the pharaoh's secondary wives, a queen named Tia. The chosen heir to the throne was not her son, a prince named Pentawer, but the son of a more favored queen. Consumed by ambition, Tia decided that if her son could not inherit the throne legally, she would seize it for him through treason and murder. The plot she orchestrated was vast and sophisticated. She recruited high-ranking officials from every branch of the government. There was the chief of the treasury, the royal chamberlains, several army generals, and even the judges who were meant to be the guardians of the law. The conspiracy had two parts. First, the military commanders would use their authority to foment a rebellion in the provinces, creating chaos that would destabilize the kingdom. The second part of the plot was far darker. At the heart of the palace, in the royal harem, the conspirators turned to black magic. The papyrus tells us they obtained a magical scroll from the royal library, which gave them the power to bewitch the minds of men. They crafted wax figurines of the pharaoh and his bodyguards. By enchanting these figures and melting them in a fire, they believed they could magically paralyze the king's limbs and disable his protectors, leaving him vulnerable to a physical attack. We do not know exactly how the plot was discovered, but it was foiled before the rebellion could begin. Ramesses III, now aware of the vipers in his own court, immediately appointed a special commission of 12 senior officials to conduct a great trial. The papyrus records the proceedings and the grim fates of the guilty. Dozens of high-ranking men were found guilty of treason and were either executed or forced to take their own lives in front of the court. The ambitious Queen Tia and the other women of the harem who had conspired with her simply disappear from the record, their fate unknown. their names erased from history. And the young prince at the center of the plot, Pentawer, was found guilty and was left to die. A euphemism that historians believe means he was given a cup of poison to drink. For centuries, it was believed the plot had failed. But a final, chilling secret was hidden beneath the pharaoh's own linen wrappings. In 2012, modern Egyptologists performed a CT scan on the mummy of Ramesses III. As they examined the images of his neck, they found something the ancient embalmers had carefully concealed: a deep, wide gash, severing his windpipe, his esophagus, and all the major blood vessels. The wound was unmistakable and would have been instantly fatal. The great hero, the savior of Egypt, the victor of the Battle of the Delta, had been assassinated. This was the true price of his victory. Ramesses III defeated the greatest external threat his nation had ever faced, an enemy that had crushed every other empire. But he could not defeat the decay from within. His victory saved the borders of Egypt, but it could not save his kingdom from its own internal rot, or himself from the ambitions of his own family. It was a heroic, but ultimately tragic final chapter for the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom.